Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the monthly Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar hosted by Everyday Organizational Designs. So this month, being Black History Month, we're celebrating health and wellness, which also translates to ensuring health and wellness in our corporate communities. We know that as organizations celebrate any communities of people throughout the year, the emphasis on their history, their impact, and also their needs, it doesn't end at the end of any monthly celebration. It is hopefully a beginning of companies understanding their responsibility to address the concerns as well as the triumphs of those communities. So today, with this being the last day of Black History Month, we wanted to bring to discussion Dr. Tawanda Hubbard, who works in social work and is also an advocate in the fight for social justice for all, and works in many outlets to help create change. But I don't want to do her a disservice in introducing who she is and all of her accolades. So Dr. Hubbard, if you will introduce yourself to us and tell us about some of the work you've done in the DEI space.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Darrylyn and Jeannine. It's an honor and a privilege to join you in this important conversation that we're having this morning about Black health and wellness. Before I talk a little bit about me, I just want to acknowledge this is the theme for 2020's Black History Month. And so I'm very excited that even on the last day of Black History Month, we are just still going 100% and celebrating Black health and wellness. So just a little bit about me. So as Darrylyn said, I am a social worker. I wear a lot of different hats in social work, excuse me. So I am an associate professor of professional practice at the Rutgers School of Social Work. Also, I have a small private practice and consulting firm. I'm a trained family therapist. Also, I do work with parents, children, individuals, couples therapy. I'm a certified child sexual abuse therapist, so I do a lot of trauma work, working with children and also adults who have unresolved issues connected to childhood sexual abuse. I'm the past president of NASW New Jersey. So that's the National Association for Social Workers New Jersey chapter. And so in that role, a lot of advocacy work being done. And still I'm doing advocacy work. Also too, I'm pursuing my second doctorate, a PhD in family science and human development. So I'm a glutton for punishment. I'm going back in, but but also too, I'm just a student for life, and so I think it's very important. There's multiple reasons why I decided to get that second PhD, but one that I think is very relevant to what we're doing now is that as a trained family therapist, there are a lot of models that we use still today that were created by white males. And so we need to bring persons of color to create knowledge, right? Represented of the Black community, but also knowledge that all can tap into to really expand their view in working with diverse populations. And you also asked me, what am I doing as far as in the DEI space? And so I have held a lot of community conversations where we processed with mental health practitioners, social work practitioners, where it was open to the public for anyone to join, internationally community conversations about what's happening in our society with social reckoning, with the political unrest, police brutality. I have also created a host of different webinars where I'm talking about navigating microaggression, implicit bias. I'm talking about racism, trauma, and mental health. And I'm going into agencies, having these talks, having these conversations. Also, too, I've been a keynote speaker for different cultural connection conferences that have invited different agencies to the table. Typically, the agencies are our social services and human service agencies and organizations that have come to the table. I'm trying to think. Oh, also in the summer of 2021, I organized and moderated a Black mental health virtual roundtable that was statewide in New Jersey, where we brought a lot of different organizational leaders, supervisors, practitioners, private practitioners, and even faith-based leadership to the table to really look closely at what does Black mental health look like today, and what are the challenges? What can we do to make Black mental health more accessible? And also, too, not just building the system, because I want to back up. I do not, and this is my opinion, I do not believe that the mental health system as it exists in its current state is designed for Black folks, right? It was not originally designed with us in mind. And so we have to come to the table and really look at the structure of how services are delivered, also to the clinical models that practitioners need. So we don't just want to say to the Black community, come engage in mental health services, but make sure that these services are culturally appropriate, relevant, informed, right? And we're not just trying to fit Black folks into certain models, but we need to bring in an Afrocentric lens, just like with other different populations on the margins. We need to make sure we're meeting people where they're at with the coping skills from their culture to be able to get their needs met, and not just individually, but collectively.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you so much. And as you can see, that's going to be kind of the foundation of what we're going to be talking about today. So, Jeannine, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Darrylyn. So hi, everyone. I'm Jeannine Brown. Welcome back to our EOD monthly DEI webinar. This is my favorite day of the month when we
That's right.
get a chance to have these discussions that we have with our clients. We get to have them with you. So I'm the chief executive for Everyday Organizational Design, also known as EOD Global. I spend a lot of my time working with our clients on designing their diversity strategies. So really looking at their organizations from a 360 lens. So both talent, how they impact their communities, how they engage with their vendors and suppliers, and as well as how do they serve their clients. And so really taking a deep dive with organizations and saying, how do we look at every practice and process within your organization and put a lens of equity in all of those spaces. So we kind of infuse equity in that to create cultures of belonging that span the entire organization. And then I also travel and speak. Well, actually travel starting to pick up for us. So we're excited about companies that are starting to want us to come back out and to engage with their employees. And so we're really looking forward to that and how this new way of doing business is going to impact diversity and inclusion. So that's what I do most of the time, and then I drive Darrylyn crazy. Monday through Friday, I get paid to work her nerves, and so I'm really excited. So I get to do that. So we have a lot of fun over here.
Can I chime in? But that's a lot. And you're doing necessary work, important work that needs to be done, because Black folks and other folks on the margins have moved into white spaces in corporate America. And so we need folks who are being able to bring that conversation and bring that structural change through education. So thank you. Thank you both, ladies.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you said that. It is good work. And I think what Darrylyn and what we consider one of our differentiators from consultants who do this work is that we bring some laughter and fun to it, because it's challenging topics from time to time.
That's right.
I recall, because we do a lot of small group work, so having conversations in organizations, and I think this topic is so important because we see this play out in every interaction with our clients.
So let's jump into the topic. So as we know, there are many Black Americans, regardless of their education, socioeconomic status, or job title, they experience some form of racism or discrimination every day. And then they have to go to work. and they have to put on, I know I used to be the perfect person to put on that mask and go through my day when I'm not emotionally or psychologically well. And that's happening every day. So many times we walk into our workspace cloaked with trauma and pain because of what we've endured or because of what we've witnessed. And this has an indirect and direct impact on us at work and the work that we do, our productivity, our enjoyment, the employee engagement at work. But we're good at putting on those masks as though we're fine. So when our culture, our identities, our ideologies, and our history is underrated, when it's misunderstood, not acknowledged or appreciated in the workplace, it impacts how we perform. And sometimes we don't even realize that there's a correlation. And so as organizational leaders, we all have to ask ourselves, are we equipping our leaders? Are you equipping your leaders to recognize behaviors and attitudes through the lens of trauma? So Dr. Hubbard, I want to ask you, with these stressors that Black Americans carry, although it might be hidden, they're dealing with a lot of external and internal stressors at work. What are some of those stressors that leaders in an organization might not recognize? And how can this stress play out at work that might be misunderstood?
Yes. Well, that's a big question, right? So that question has multiple layers to it. So when you think about Black Americans, when you think about, first, let me make this note, we are not a monolithic group. There is diversity within the Black community. So that's important for us to recognize and to note. When you talk about stress, right? So there's different types of stress. There's actually stress that is what we call a positive stress. And so with that stress helps us to kind of grow and stretch ourselves, right? It motivates us. But then there are different other kinds of stress, right? And so there's stress that can be a little bit overwhelming for us in that moment, where we would need to activate our coping skills and our strategies, right? But it doesn't cause us to shut down, right? And then we move on to more toxic stress, right? And so toxic stress typically is coming from the environment, right? Or it can be an interpersonal close relationship. So when you think about in an interpersonal close relationship, abuses, domestic violence, right? Also too, when you think about environmental stressors, the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, when you just think about, in New Jersey, we had a few weeks ago, a 14-year-old boy got into a fight with another teenage boy in a mall, a local mall. And when the cops came on the scene, they immediately put handcuffs on the darker skinned boy, the Black boy, and threw him to the ground and put knees in his back. Right. And so we constantly are being exposed to. I'm glad that we have videos today, but there's a lot of vicarious trauma that we just bear witness to, seeing, the discrimination and the violence, state sanctioned violence against Black folks, right? Because when that's done, that could have been my nephew, my brother, my father, right? When we see violence against a Black woman, that could have been me, my sister, my daughter, right? And so there are a lot of stressors we deal with, right? We also still are dealing with our historical ancestry trauma, right? Because we're reminded of the inequities and the discrimination, the prejudice that still exists today, right? We live in a society where pretty much blindness ideology kind of prevails, where there's this idea that, from the dominant perspective that, race is really not a factor anymore, right? You got Black folks in middle class and in top positions and, but it's still very much a factor for us because the system is designed in such a way and still operates in such a way to advantage those of the dominant group over those who are on the margins. And so what's so important is that understanding that there is an emotional and psychological toll just being in a Black body navigating the world, right? Because there are so many negative stereotypes. People see us through these negative images of being angry, aggressive, dangerous, inferior, lazy, right? There's so many negative stereotypes about Black individuals, about Black families, and we have to contend against them, right?
Mhm.
And then when we come into the workspace, right? It is a space when you talk about professionalism. Professionalism speaks to the dominance norms and standards, right?
Right.
So then depending on the way you wear your hair, the way you dress, the language that you utilize, you can be criticized for that. You can be excluded because of that. You can be denied promotions because of that. And then also too, you know, when things are done well, sometimes when Black people are successful and accomplish and do things, they can be looked at with surprise because of low expectations, because of not thinking that we are really intelligent. And then we have to contend with the other idea that we got to where we got to because of affirmative action, that we're really
Right.
not qualified. And, and I go to tell people often, if you see a Black person in a top position, they are more than qualified, because Black people have had to do so much more to get
More.
there, to prove themselves that they belong there. And even when they're there is still suspicion, right? And
Mhm.
inclusion, right? And so with all of that, right, that's stressful. Right.
Mhm.
So, and I just spoke about relational and environmental, right? And the historical kind of aftershocks, right? But think about if people have their own internal struggles, intrapsyche, right? Now, what we do know, what the research tells us, and there's good data with this, is that, their racism, dealing with that definitely leads to anxiety and depression,
Mhm.
right? But we do have this stereotype about us that speaks to we're resilient. Right?
Right.
But I tell people, not every group is made to be as resilient as we have to be,
Mhm.
right? And sometimes we get tired of being so resilient.
Exactly.
Right? We get tired. And then don't let me speak about just the Black woman, with superwoman syndrome. We've always had to be the backbone to hold it down in the community and the family. And often we're holding it down in the workplace too.
Mhm.
Right. And so that's a lot that we're carrying with us. And his name is Dr. Washington. There is a quote that I wanted to share with you. It's a really good quote. And I think that it speaks well to what I'm talking about and what it is that you want employers to understand. If I can just find it for a second. But
No
he
problem.
talks about, if I can paraphrase it, he talks about the need for us to understand a people, right? If you're looking to support, to care for, to help, you have got to understand a people from their lived experiences,
Mhm.
their realities, their social historical positionality, right? You cannot stand from your social location and project your perspective onto the people to try to help them. You must understand them from their social location, their social historical position, and their lived realities and experiences.
Mhm. Absolutely. And, I think that a few things that you said that just jump out at me, but one of the things that I know is true is you have a lot of people who try to put their thoughts based on their social experiences, based on their historical
Mhm.
relevance of their perceived relevance of our history. And so you
Mhm.
have people who say, well, you all should be over racism by now. I mean, over slavery by now, or racism really isn't that bad because they're not experiencing or they don't see the
That's right.
value of it. So it's important. That last point that you made is very important. Jeannine, I want to ask you a question. Like, do you think, because we do a lot of work with organizational leaders, but what do you think about organizational leaders? Are they doing enough to support their staff? And if so, what are many doing well, or what can be done better or more of? What do we need more of?
So, yeah, when you think about through the lens of what Dr. Hubbard just spoke about, right? Black people are impacted by racism in a way that is both systemic, both interpersonal, right? Dealing with people one-to-one or in small groups, and then internalized. So I want to say organizational leaders are doing yes and no, right? So the answer is yes and no. Are they doing enough? Your organization is just as good as the individual leader. And I think individually, you do have some leaders who are very well aware and tapped in to the impact that what's happening in society impacts their employees. Now, is that across gender and racial lines? Does it hit every intersectionality that one person can be? I would say no. I think it's hard to do that, right? So I think if we take into account the human aspect, right? How do I do that on a one-to-one level with all the people that I work with? It's going to be a challenge. I said, but there's so much opportunity. And I think this is where companies can say, you know what, we recognize, because COVID showed us, if organizations did not learn anything in the first 6 months of the pandemic, when we completely shut down, about how to continue to engage with their employees, to understand what employees are dealing with in the workplace, I don't even know what could show them any better. Like, I feel like if you didn't see it then, you're intentionally not looking.
Intentionally ignoring it.
Yeah. And so what I've seen companies do really well is to stop and acknowledge the whole person, right? We know that you have these responsibilities to deliver this work, but we're going to check in with you one-to-one, right? They equip their organizational leaders, from the CEO down to, a supervisor, a newly promoted supervisor, and how to do touch bases and checking in with their employees, how to pause when we're in meetings to just ask, hey, is there anything that you need from us? How can I better support you in this environment that we're working in? People are struggling with traumatic stressors. We saw that slide come up. They're stressed with isolation and loneliness. And oftentimes they were dealing with this when we were gathering together. They felt overlooked, not invited to lunch, not invited to play golf on the weekends, right? They were socially excluded because of the otherness. And now there's an opportunity for companies to say, you know what, we're all on equal playing grounds now. None of us are playing golf. So how do we continue to impact and touch base with our employees? So I think there's a lot of opportunity. What's missing is an organized effort of what does that look like?
Right.
What does it look like for our Black employees? What does it look like for women? What does it look like, so on and so forth, and being able to execute on it in a continuous and sustainable way.
And in a little bit, I want to ask Dr. Hubbard about something she shared with me, the value of trauma-informed supervision and care. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But based on some of what we've been talking about, we know that we often operate in an environment where we have to assimilate, where we have to, code switch to be accepted. And so I wanted to ask Dr. Hubbard, when you hear about people assimilating or code switching just to be accepted at work, or as Jeannine said, just to not be excluded, which has a micro message, it says, I'm not accepted for the identity I hold. And the dominant culture, either consciously or unconsciously, demands that I behave outside of my normative culture. Do you feel that people of color are allowed to be who they are, just, socially? And how would you encourage companies even from a wellness or well-being standpoint, to meet them where they are?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, you know, we all have to figure out the different roles that we occupy, right? And so we're not reduced to a role. So when you go in and you're an employee, that's just a role. That's not who you are, right? And so we need to be mindful because what's the quote from Audre Lorde? If I don't define myself for myself, I'll be crushed into other people's fantasies of being eaten alive, right? So we
Right.
have got to define who we are. Now, it is a challenge when there are pressures that are coming at us to assimilate, right? Authenticity is so important here, right? For people to be able to own themselves and people to be able to be reflective and really self-examine, because what's the price that you're paying to be in this role, in this job, and is it worth it? And then also
Right.
too, having strong self-advocacy skills is
Mhm.
also key. And there's another concept that I think we'll talk about a little bit later, psychological safety, because
Yes.
here's the thing. So there's this concept called personhood. It's a pretty big concept. It exists across a lot of different disciplines. But when you think about personhood, it has this social relational component to it that you see my humanity, and I'm becoming who I am in relation to you. And so how we see and treat and interact with people is also important. So this is not something that's solely the responsibility of the individual. And employers, organizations, and supervisors also play a piece to this. So it was something you said earlier, Darrylyn, when you talked about how slavery is in the past, and people say it's in the past, it shouldn't be an issue anymore, right? And I just want to loop that in here, because there's so many reasons why slavery is still present with us, right? Is because of my ancestors were considered 3/5 of a human being, a person. And when you think about that, at the core of that is in the inferiority ideology, that we were less than, we were inferior. And so when you think about that, to add on dehumanization. And so when you look at people in a less than way and they're beneath you, they're inferior, which still happens today. Still happens today. You are dehumanizing people, and it is easy to oppress a people who you dehumanize, right? And so that still exists in the mechanism that's within our society today. And so when you talk about the need to code switch, to be bicultural, right? We have to understand that, and Dr. Elijah Anderson has a book called Black and White Spaces, right? That this society was not designed with us at the table, putting our input in about how it would be inclusive and how there's going to be equity, right? The Declaration of Independence said created for all men, and they weren't even including white women. They weren't including white men who didn't have property, and they sure enough was including us and indigenous persons, right? Because we were considered 3/5 of a human. And so we have to keep in mind the way the system was designed was to exclude us. And so when we're going into these different spaces, we need to understand what we will have to contend with. And we need our authenticity. Our strength and our power comes from our own personal identity and our authority. We can't look outside of us for that validation, right? And so that's something important for us to know, and for employers to know too, that they have to make the environment conducive, right? To be able to allow. And so it's not just saying a few words, having a potluck, bringing in a training, right? But what are the practices, the policies, right? What are the pictures on the wall? What does the physical environment look like? You don't just have us sitting at the table, but we're also decision makers and participants actively in this, creating the policies, the practices, the products, right? And so with that, that helps to validate authenticity of who we say we are. But we have to be good stewards of that. And we have to hold organizations and leaderships accountable to create an environment that helps to fuel that. I hope I
Absolutely.
answered the question. I know I
Oh,
said a lot there.
absolutely, absolutely,
Yeah.
you did. And it makes me think of, I in one of the classes that I teach, and we had a person who said, "We've always allowed you to be yourself." And I said, "Let me give you one very simple example. I wear my hair curly. I wear it natural, the way it comes out of my head. I wasn't always allowed to do that and be considered professional. I had
That's
to
right.
assimilate to what the normative culture said was the right way to wear your hair professionally, which was straightened, which is stressful on my hair. And the fact that we have had to have laws passed, the Crown Act passed, so that Black women can show up in their professional spaces with being authentically who they are, from even a hair perspective. Like, why should that have to happen? But we have to advocate for ourselves and be able to stand up and say, this is not who we are, and we should not be held to your standards for your comfort. So
That's right. But there was a time, and see, this is where, we as a community have to make our paradigm shifts as well, because there was a time our survival depended on white folks being comfortable, because if they were not comfortable, our lives could have ended. And still we deal with that today a little bit. So
okay, this is getting good. Okay, Jeannine, so now I got a question for you. Let's talk about, and Dr. Hubbard, I'm gonna loop you in on the end of this because you mentioned microaggressions and psychological safety, but I know Jeannine does a lot of work in organizations with psychological safety. Why are companies bringing you in to talk about psychological safety? What's going on in the workplace, specifically relative to Black employees, because we're talking about that during this month, but what is happening that organizations are beginning to understand the need to focus on psychological safety?
One of the biggest things that has been happening is that Black employees have been calling for a reckoning within their organizations. They are writing soliloquies about the culture and the environment. Like they are banding together, or even one person. I have a particular client, and one person, she's a senior manager in her organization, and took it upon herself in 2020 to write a letter to her chief executive and the board of her organization and laid it out. So people are being called out and called on the carpet. And I think we have a new workforce who has the audacity to stand up against white supremacy in their organizations. And we have a new leader. So we have new leadership that is willing to listen. And so when we go in and start talking about psychological safety, and for those of you who are not familiar with the term, psychological safety, in a nutshell, is really about creating cultures where people can speak up with direct, open, and honest feedback and communication without the threat or jeopardy of losing their job or retaliation.
That's right.
Right. And so they have this interpersonal and social support, right? So we've empowered people. And I'm gonna take it back. We haven't empowered them, because if you can empower someone, you might be able to disempower them. So let's say we help organizations really create cultures where people can speak up, and that's it. And they know they can speak up. And they have a process in which they can speak up. And so I think that's what's happening. We've had employees write letters, call their own meetings. Even in the surveys that we do when we're looking at organizations and we execute an employee engagement survey, we don't just collect quantitative data. We're now having qualitative conversations to support that data or speak and give better light to that data, because I can evaluate a team and they can all say that they enjoy their jobs, but it might not, because they get to do what they enjoy. It's a dream job for them, right? Because this happens even in organizations that have toxic workplaces. But until I talk to employees, I don't hear about Joe who's constantly dropping microaggressions about the Asian people or about the African woman who uses her God-given name from her family, right? He's tripping up on the pronunciation or refusing. Right, to pronounce it correctly. So that's what we do. We come in and companies want to figure it out because what they're finding out in writing in black and white, that they have some bad actors in their organizations and people don't feel like they can speak up. And they see that and it manifests through low productivity, low engagement, right? Employees are not engaging. They're not coming to the social, they're not participating in the social aspects in the organization to get to know one another. And people are asking the question, well, where is Jeannine? Where is Darrylyn? And then when they come and ask, I said, you know what? Y'all not doing anything that speaks to me. I'm not interested in it. It doesn't impact my culture, right? We're constantly talking about the same things.
Or I don't feel like I belong.
That's exactly
don't want to be there.
Yep. And that's it too, right? So psychological safety is a response to creating cultures where there's more belonging, but giving people the assurance that when they speak up, they will not be retaliated against, or their jobs will not be in jeopardy.
Okay. Before we turn to you, Dr. Hubbard, we have a question from a participant. Carla, do you want to share it?
Absolutely. We have a question from Dawn, and her question is, how can we as employers better support our team members, and how can we impact and touch base with them?
Excellent question.
So one of the things I think is, one, letting them know that you are there to support them. I think companies think that, of course, my employees know I'm here for them, right? Of course, they know that I will stop what I'm doing and listen. And actually, they don't, right? If we spend 90% of our time with engaging, talking only about the work product, then they don't believe that who they are individually matters. And so I think one of the things we definitely have to do is give people space and let them know, make the announcement, hey, we're going to, when we meet today, we're going to spend some time just touching base. I want to make sure all of you are okay, find out what you need, and then having those conversations one-to-one. I think bringing humanity back into the workplace is essential in helping your team members cope with what's going on in the world, to speak specifically to them. And not every Black person is moved by the same thing. So Dr. Hubbard talked about we're not a monolith, but it's okay to touch base and say, hey, I know these things are happening right now. If you need us, what can we do for you? These are resources, and let your employees know what the resources are that are available to them so that they can speak up and they have this, they know that, hey, I work for a company that not only cares if I do great graphic design work, but they also care how I'm doing at home. They know I have 2 boys and this is happening in the world, and they check in on me and my children. And it only takes seconds to do something like that, but it goes a very long way.
Can I just add something to that as well? So Jeannine, I also too, when I was brought into some of these agencies and even into university spaces to do some of my webinars and presentations, letters were shared with me that staff members had wrote, so that I can really get a sense of what they saw was not being done. A lot of folks were scared and nervous that this was like a fad, that it was going to go away. Right. So what you're saying, Jeannine, about these spaces of talking, there was one thing I also added when I said to organizational leaders was that you really do need to look at your practices and your policies, because there needs to be structural changes in place too, because it's nice and to be able to talk to people, see where people are at, but then also to where are you structurally supporting people? Where does your policies and your practices speak to their well-being overall? And because it's so important to be seen, to be heard, to be connected with, and to belong in a way where I see me in your policies and your practices too. And so that, to me, I think it's so important, because you can talk, but you got to put your action. You know,
Right.
you got to make sure you are showing that, and not just having there's all these committees that have risen up, but really giving the agency a report card of where you guys stand, and really looking at, you know, what practices perpetuate the colorblind ideology. Where are you actually, you know, looking to have equity and recognize, and making sure you're in this room, excuse me, you're in a meeting space, you're looking around a room and there's certain people that's not at the table.
Right.
How do you remedy that, right? How do you remedy you're serving certain client populations, but it doesn't reflect who's in leadership, right? And so there are real tangible things that need to be done that can bring a shift, a paradigm shift in environment. So I just wanted to add that.
And I think that one thing that is important to also connect both of those is that when you go into organizations and we talk to the people and we talk to the leaders and maybe the people about the experiences they're having and the leaders about their policies and practices, one of the things that the people talk about is when policies and practices are in place, many times there's inequities in how they're held to those same policies, those same practices. And so how are you defining those to a point where you can hold everyone accountable equitably across the board? And how do your blind spots or your unconscious bias come into how you're holding people accountable to those policies? So we have to think about that part as well. So let me ask you, Dr. Hubbard, because you mentioned something to me last week when we were chatting, and I thought it was a very novel concept that I had not really heard about. You were talking about trauma-informed supervision and care in organizations. Can you talk to us about what it is, how it can validate the stressors of employees and the impact that it would have on them feeling cared for? And then what are some steps organizations can take to just learn more about trauma-informed supervision and care?
So trauma-informed supervision is not new in the social mental health behavioral world, not at all. And so, because we work with a lot of folks who have experienced trauma, but this idea of this trauma-informed approach really speaks to this need for us to recognize that trauma is prevalent. Right. And then also too, in organizations, to do that shift from being to really look closely at oneself as an organization and recognize, are we causing trauma? Are we perpetuating? Or are we looking to run our business in such a way, interact in such a way, have policies and practices in such a way that reduce trauma? We're not triggering folks. And so a good resource to go to is SAMHSA, right? The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So it's samhsa.gov. They have so many resources out there. And so when you talk about, they even have a framework where they talk about trauma-informed care being 4 R's, right? And so they talk about, first, realizing trauma exists, that it's prevalent, and that trauma affects peoples and groups. That's realizing. Number 2, recognize the signs of trauma, right? How people are affected, right? Because it can come out in people's attitudes, it can come out in behaviors, and you might be misreading those behaviors and attitudes, thinking people have a bad attitude, or people, oh, they're just being late on purpose, and you don't know what's happening, what's going on for them, why they're these behaviors. You should become curious, right, to know what's happening, especially if someone is behaving in a way that's not according to their norm. You want to know what's going on, which is really important. And then the third one is responding to the trauma, right? Making sure that there are systemic practices and policies, and also supervisor styles, right? That really factor in that kind of sensitivity, curiosity, that empathy, you know, that care that's really needed. And then the 4th R is resisting re-traumatizing folks. And so I'm saying trauma. So when I'm talking about trauma basically, in a very simple format, it means It could be an event or a series event, because trauma is very subjective, right?
Mhm.
So one person can experience something traumatically, another person cannot, right? And so it is very individualized. So you have to trust that person's judgment and perspective when they tell you they're traumatized, right? And so it is this event or series event that has overwhelmed their ordinary systems of care. And so what they do normally day to cope just does not measure up. And they are left with this feeling of helplessness and powerlessness, and it has a lasting effect on them. So it's so important for us to understand what trauma is, right?
Mhm.
And that's in a very general sense. Now, there's different types of trauma, but that's just a very general sense. Also, SAMHSA has this 5 guiding principles, right? So
Mhm.
when you're really talking about wanting to incorporate trauma informed approach into your organization, you really need to look at safety. And like Jeannine said, psychological safety, physical safety, right? You really need to look at safety, people feeling safe enough to be there, right? And then not just from your perspective, but from their perspective, right? Very important, because we need to, there's this idea, concept called intersectionality, right? And
Mhm.
so, you have to think about not just race and gender, right? And class. So they intersect with the power structures, the system we have in America, this interconnected system of privilege and oppression. And so safety is important. Also, choice. Are people given choice, right? Because one thing about something being traumatizing, it takes our control from us. It takes our power from us. And so people need to be in spaces and places they can get that sense of control back, have choice. Also, are you being collaborative? Are you creating opportunities for people to collaborate, right? It's a bi-directional relationship. And then trustworthiness. Do you
Mhm.
do what you say? Do you follow up the way you need to follow up,
Mhm.
right? Are things reliable and dependable? Are they trustworthy? And then the last is empowerment. And I agree with Jeannine. So when I'm working with families and groups, um, the language I utilize is that we can assist them in shifting from a disempowered to an empowered place, right? Helping with that shift, but I cannot empower them, right? They have their own resources and tools, but can I help facilitate getting things out of their way?
Mhm.
Right, that they can then be able to be empowered. And if they need skills like assertiveness, right, refusal skills to be able to do that. And so when you think about it, a trauma-informed workplace really recognizes trauma on an individual, a departmental, and an organizational level. And when you think about an organization, I think it's useful to think about an organization as a living community of
Mhm.
people in different roles that can be a staff person, a manager, a supervisor, right? Leadership, but it is a living community. Organizations, they come together. It's a collection of people coming together to do interdependent activity to meet a mission or goal. But
Mhm.
it's made up of people. And I think we forget that. We can't objectify and dehumanize people. People are in the roles. They are not the roles. And that's so important, because when you are looking to have a trauma-informed approach, it's a very person-centered approach, very
Mhm.
aware of the environment and the interactions that people are in, right?
Yeah, that's
So-
good. That is so
mm,
good. And I just wanted to say one quick thing. I thought that you touched on that. I always say we have to bring the human approach, and people
mhm.
are not their roles. I'm not the payroll clerk, right? That
That's right.
I manage payroll, right? That's what I do when I'm here with you. And I think, and I do think that we've had a chance because we've been able to see into the homes of people, right? We see beds and all of these things now because we have a glimpse into people's, not just what they do, but into their homes, that we see. I hope that we're seeing a more human side of who they are and the work that we're doing, and that leaders can take all of this into consideration, which is a lot, right? We're expecting people to do so much now at work. We have to fully equip them. And people are not waiting around anymore, especially our younger workforce. They're getting out of there if they don't feel like the leadership is capable of not only helping them develop professionally, but also personally.
So as we begin to wrap up today, there's a couple of things I want to say. I know there was a question that came in from a person, Daniel. Carla, I'm gonna have you read that in a minute. And then I see Dr. Vic Baker, who is one of our favorites, and who will be joining us again to have some further discussion. I think he made a comment as well. So Carla, can you share those with us? And then I will wrap up with our final question.
Absolutely. So we just did have a request from Tamara. She wanted to get the resource material as well as the website from Dr. Hubbard that when she was speaking about the trauma, if we can provide that for everyone. And then we do have a question from Daryl, I believe his name is pronounced.
Okay, and before you go there, Carla, if you can put in, it's samsa.gov, SAMSA.gov. When you get a chance, if you could put that in the chat so that everybody can have that.
Got it.
Okay,
SAMSA.gov. Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, so the question from Daryl was, how do you suggest to navigate around Black people that are put in leadership positions that have been put there actually to block other Black people from progressing in corporate America?
Ooh, that's a whole word.
It's very deep.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that I don't know if we can address it all. The first thing I would say is I hope no one's working in an environment like that. Right. So I think, we have to be really careful between our perceived ideas of why things are happening and then what is actually happening. So all I have to say is I hope no one is working in a culture like that.
And I like, go ahead, Dr. Hubbard.
Well, I was, so what's important for us, I think, to keep in mind is that we're all in this world trying to negotiate being in Black bodies and taking care of ourselves, our families, surviving, thriving, negotiating. And so we do have to step back sometimes to kind of see, it can be different than what we understand, right? And so that's important. Now, I do recognize that not all our skin folks are our kin folk. I'm not going to act like that. So I recognize that. I know that colorism exists, and I think you're speaking about tokenism, right? But I'm not sure. So there are some folks who have across history, Black folks who were kind of labeled as the token Black person, and they got into a specific role or position that was high up. But I wonder, it opens up doors, it creates pathways. And so it's trying to connect and build bridges. I ask people to be bridge makers. It's easy for us to kind of stand on the other side and kind of point fingers, but what about trying to collaborate, build bridges? And, not everybody will hold the same perspective and view. But what can we do to create some unity and to recognize that two opposing ideas can both be true. So we don't have to think the same way to collaborate. And so but I like Jeannine said, I would definitely dig deeper, do my homework on that to understand and recognize how far you can go with a certain person, and where can you open up other spaces, right? To be able to collaborate with people who look like you and sound like you and act like you, right? That's very important, I think.
And we have
competition is real.
And be respectful of those opposing views as well.
Well, and I think it's also important to realize that, being honest, some people are put in a position to block other people who look like you. Do they recognize that that's why they're in the position? That's
like that's why they're being used.
Do they recognize they're being used? And are you willing to have conversation to share with them why you feel they've been put in that position in that way? And then if they're being put in a position of power, how can you all work together so that what they're trying to accomplish doesn't happen? If the organization, if that's what they're trying to accomplish, how can you work with that person who's been put in that position so that it doesn't happen? And there's two realities to that. Either they say, no, I'm not in that position for that reason, and I'm not willing to do anything about it. That's their individual trauma pain point that they're dealing with. And we can't change people and their perspectives. We can influence them, but we can't change them. Or if you do bring that understanding to them and they're willing to work with you, it's always strategy. You have to develop a strategy. It's always strategic. We are so far over time. So before anybody jumps in, I want to get the point that was made from Dr. Baker, and then we'll wrap up with our last question. If Dr. Hubbard and then Jeannine can talk about the joy. We did not talk about the joy, and we're going to do that in just a minute or two. But first, let's get Dr. Baker's comment, Carla.
Yes, so Dr. Baker, let me go back. Let's see. Dr. Baker said that there is always an offer to be an Uncle Tom. But he also said earlier that trauma-infused and informed leadership as it can be another tool in the transformational leadership model. So he touched on 2 points.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Dr. Baker, just get ready, because we're tapping on your door again very soon. All right. So the last question as we wrap this up, because this has been an awesome discussion, so much so we've gone over about 15 minutes, is what are some of your thoughts on how we can focus on joy? Like, what reframing or cognitive shifts can we make when we hear, we're being inclusive, but companies are not actually doing the work to understand the stress and dynamics of being Black in America? As we wrap it up, what do each of you say? Dr. Hubbard, you first, and then Jeannine.
Yeah. So to me, joy is about our meaning making. I think human beings are meaning making creatures. And when you talk about joy, it's very individualistic. What makes someone joyful? We have to identify and do that work to identify what makes us joyful. Some people don't slow down and kind of reflect, so they need to prioritize themselves. I think it's very important. What do they do that brings them joy? What is done in the community, in the collective, that brings them joy? I think that's important to be able to identify, and also to connecting joy to our overall wellness, right? And so we have to do the work to kind of identify where are we at spiritually, physically, intellectually, socially, even economically, right? Environmentally, right? And also our relationships. And so, to me, joy is something that, very personal. And so it's something that if you have not figured out yet what brings you joy, that's something you need to invest in. And it's something that you need to prioritize, because you want more of that in your life, right? And also, too, it makes me think about balance. Because as you deal with stressors, I always tell folks that I work with, when you are stressed, that is the time that you increase your self-care. You don't keep it at a lower level like when everything is good. You need to up and prioritize your self-care and incorporating those things in that you love to have that balance, right? Because often what we do is kind of just push ahead and push through and plow through, and then you're exhausted at the end. We need to be incorporating more balance, not just within ourselves, but also within our relationships. So sometimes you do need to tell people no. And when they get all reactive with you, say something like this to them. Say to them, instead of you hearing me say no, can you instead hear me saying yes to my health, to my wellness, to my joy?
Oh, I love it. Absolutely. Wait a minute. Say that one more time. I'm going to write that down. I got a few people I can say that to. Say it one more time.
Instead of you hearing me saying no to you, hear me saying yes to my health, to my wellness, to my joy.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Hubbard. Jeannine, you want to wrap us up?
You're welcome.
Well, I just want, I'm very idealistic. So I just really, I just want people to own their stories and your authenticity as much as possible as you can in every space and environment that you go into. I think if we start off by being our true authentic selves, then we have no choice but to stay our true authentic selves, right? Or identify, hey, this isn't the right culture for the true authentic me.
Right.
And then maybe I move on. So I just want to add that to what Dr. Hubbard said. I think we do have to find our own joy, but we have to also use our voices, be our authentic and true selves, and then understand, right? And you hit it on the head. I talk about, we make meaning out of so many different things, but let's make impact, right? Let's impact our organizations in a way that is transformational and hold them accountable for your development and your growth in that space. And if there's anything that we can do for you to help you have those conversations, just please let us know.
Let us know. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We love having these conversations. These are conversations we have all the time with the organizations that we work with, but we realize it's bigger than that. And it's important for us to share on a higher platform. So please, please, please join back in with us next month. We'll let you know what our topic is. If you are on LinkedIn, go and follow us at EOD Global, and you will be able to see what the topic of next month is. But we're always looking for solutions. We're looking for innovative ideas so that organizations and individuals can understand how we need to center the people in organizations and in our communities. So thank you for joining us today.